The escape pod screamed through Kepler-9's atmosphere like falling stars, except stars don't usually leave craters in perfectly tended vegetable gardens. The peaceful village of Haven's Edge had been enjoying another gloriously uneventful morning when the sky decided to deliver 3 packages nobody had ordered. Magistrate Kestrel, a dignified quell whose feathers ruffled at the slightest disturbance, stood at the edge of the largest crater and wondered if his quiet retirement posting was about to become significantly less quiet. The twisted metal that had once been an escape pod lay smoking in what used to be Farmer Gorix's prize-winning squash patch. Gorix, being a gentle Molthan whose bark-like skin had turned a distressed shade of brown, was currently trying to salvage what remained of his vegetables while muttering about compensation and cosmic insurance policies. "Well," Kestrel said, adjusting his ceremonial robes and trying to sound authoritative, "this is unexpected." That was when the first pod cracked open like a particularly aggressive egg, and out crawled something that made every villager within 50 meters take 3 very large steps backward. It was small, bipedal, and covered in what appeared to be dried blood and dirt. Its eyes darted around with the kind of feral intelligence that suggested it was already cataloging escape routes and potential weapons. "Human," whispered Willa, the village healer, her crystalline Nexari form catching the morning light as she trembled. "It's a human child." The creature, because that's what it looked like to the terrified villagers, couldn't have been more than 12 cycles old, but it moved with the coiled tension of a predator. Its hair was matted, its clothes torn, and when it opened its mouth to speak, the sounds that came out were a mixture of what might have been galactic standard and something far more primitive. "Stay back!" the young human growled, brandishing a piece of metal debris like a weapon. "I won't let you hurt them." Them? Oh yes, there were more. The second pod discharged its occupant with less drama but equal effect on the villagers' collective nervous systems. This one appeared female, slightly smaller, with calculating eyes that swept the gathering crowd like a military scanner. She immediately positioned herself between the villagers and the third pod, which was making ominous creaking sounds. "Finn," she said to the first child, her voice carrying surprising authority for someone who barely reached most adults' waists. "Weapons assessment. How many hostiles?" Finn, apparently that was its name, did a quick count of the gathering villagers. 43 visible, mixed species. No obvious weapons, but his eyes fixed on Thorn, the village blacksmith whose Molthan physique made him tower over everyone else. That one's big enough to be dangerous. Thorn, who had never hurt so much as a grain weevil in his entire existence, found himself the subject of intense tactical scrutiny from a being that barely reached his knee joints. He raised his branch-like hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace, which only seemed to make the children more suspicious. The third pod finally gave up its occupant with a sound like breaking glass. This one was the smallest yet, probably no more than 8 cycles, but when he emerged, he let out a sound that was part war cry, part wounded animal, and entirely terrifying to a village of beings who considered raised voices to be aggressive behavior. Vale, the female, apparently called Luna, rushed to the smallest child's side. "Status report. Any injuries?" Vale's response was to grab a handful of dirt and rocks, his small hands moving with practiced efficiency as he prepared makeshift projectiles. "Perimeter secure," he announced in a voice that should have been asking for bedtime stories, not establishing tactical positions. Kestrel found his voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than the authoritative tone he'd been practicing. "Children, young beings, we mean you no harm. This is Haven's Edge, a peaceful settlement. You're safe here." The 3 humans exchanged glances that conveyed more information than most adults could manage in a full conversation. Finn stepped forward, still clutching his makeshift weapon, and spoke in carefully measured words. "Safe is relative. Your species designations." "I beg your pardon?" Kestrel's feathers were now standing at angles that suggested either extreme confusion or the early stages of a molt. "He's asking what kind of aliens we are," Willa translated, her crystalline voice chiming with nervous energy. "They want to know if we're hostile." Luna's eyes narrowed. Previous encounters with non-hostiles resulted in betrayal. Trust parameters require verification. The villagers stared at this 10-cycle-old who spoke like a military briefing and moved like she was constantly calculating attack vectors. This was not how first contact scenarios were supposed to go. There should have been universal translators, diplomatic protocols, maybe some nice refreshments and polite cultural exchanges. Instead, they had 3 traumatized human children who looked like they'd been raised by particularly militant wolves. "Look," said Thorne, his voice a gentle rumble that came from somewhere deep in his trunk-like chest. "Why don't we start with getting you cleaned up and fed? You've been through something terrible, haven't you?" That's when Vale, the smallest and presumably least dangerous of the 3, demonstrated exactly why humans had such a fearsome reputation across the galaxy. In one fluid motion, he launched 3 rocks with pinpoint accuracy that struck the ground in a perfect triangle around Thorne's feet. A warning shot that wouldn't have been out of place in a military exercise. "No approach without clearance," Vale announced, his childish voice at odds with his tactical precision. "Finn, they're trying flanking maneuvers." Indeed, several villagers had unconsciously started to spread out, more from natural crowd dynamics than any military strategy. But the children read it as a coordinated assault formation. Kestrel realized this situation was rapidly escalating beyond his expertise in municipal drainage disputes and harvest festival planning. These weren't just refugee children. They were survivors of something that had turned them into tiny, efficient warriors who trusted nothing and no one. "Everyone stop moving," he called out, surprised by his own authority. "Just, everyone stay exactly where you are." The 3 humans immediately shifted into a defensive triangle, backs to each other, covering all angles. It was a formation that spoke of hard experience and harder lessons. "Smart," Finn acknowledged grudgingly. "Reduces variables." "Temporary measure," Luna added, her eyes never stopping their constant surveillance. "We require food, water, and shelter. Terms of engagement." Terms of engagement? These were children asking for the basic necessities of life as if they were negotiating a military contract. What in the name of all the peaceful moons had happened to them? Willa stepped forward slowly, her hands visible and empty. "We'll provide everything you need. No terms, no conditions. Just help. Because that's what neighbors do." The 3 humans processed this statement like it was written in an alien language, which, Kestrel reflected grimly, it probably was to them. The concept of unconditional assistance seemed as foreign to these children as their tactical efficiency was to the villagers. "Analyzing," Luna muttered to her companions. "Probability of deception, moderate to high. Recommend cautious acceptance with prepared extraction protocols." Vale nodded seriously. "Agreed, but we need supplies." Finn made the decision with the weight of someone far older than his apparent cycles. "Acceptable, but we maintain defensive positions and ready status." And that's how Haven's Edge acquired its first human residents. 3 traumatized children who approached a simple offer of hospitality like it was a potential trap, in a village of beings who approached these same children like they were potential catastrophes. Neither side was entirely wrong, though it would take time for everyone to realize that being dangerous and being evil were not, in fact, the same thing at all. The real education was just beginning. 3 weeks later, Haven's Edge had learned several important lessons about human children. First, they could pick locks with vegetable stems. Second, they treated every meal like it might be their last. Third, they had an unsettling tendency to appear silently behind you when you least expected it, usually while you were discussing them in hushed tones. Willa discovered this last point firsthand when she turned around in her healing garden to find all 3 humans crouched in perfect concealment behind her crystal formations, apparently conducting what Luna called intelligence gathering, but what everyone else called eavesdropping. You know, Willa said conversationally, not bothering to look directly at them. If you're curious about something, you could just ask. Finn's voice emerged from somewhere behind a particularly large formation. Questions reveal tactical requirements. Information freely given could be intentionally misleading. Or, Vale added helpfully, you could be nice now and stab us later. Happens a lot. Willa's crystalline form flickered with what, in an Nexari, indicated profound sadness. These children spoke of betrayal with the casual familiarity of beings discussing the weather. What exactly had they survived? She settled herself on the ground, making her considerably less imposing than her usual 7-foot height. Fair point, but consider this. If I wanted to harm you, would I really be spending my mornings teaching you which plants heal and which ones make you violently ill? There was a long pause, filled with what Willa had learned to recognize as tactical consultation via meaningful glances. Educational value could be long-term investment, Luna finally admitted. But probability of genuine intent is increasing. Translation, you're starting to trust me. Trust is complicated, Finn said, emerging partially from his hiding spot. But you haven't tried to separate us. Others always try to separate us. The casual way he said it made Willa's light flicker again. Of course. Divide and conquer. The oldest strategy in the book. Someone had taught these children that staying together meant staying alive. Well then, she said brightly. Good thing I have absolutely no intention of doing that. In fact, I was hoping you'd help me with something. 3 small heads poked out completely now, curiosity warring with suspicion. The Molthan younglings have been asking about you, Willa continued. They're fascinated by humans, but they're also terrified. Their parents have been telling them stories about your species that are less than flattering. Propaganda, Luna said matter-of-factly. Standard xenophobia protocols. What's the tactical objective? No tactics, Willa said. Just maybe show them you're not monsters. The little ones are naturally curious, but fear is learned behavior. Vale perked up at this. Little ones? How little? About your age, actually. Molthan development is slower, so they're still in their sapling stage. That afternoon, Haven's Edge witnessed something unprecedented. 3 human children voluntarily interacting with alien younglings without a single tactical assessment or defensive formation in sight. It started when a young Molthan named Pip, whose bark was still the soft green of new growth, dropped his favorite toy over the garden wall and started crying with the heartbroken intensity that only small beings could achieve. Before any adult could react, Vale had scaled the wall with the kind of casual athleticism that made everyone nervous, retrieved the toy, and dropped back down. Here, he said simply, offering the carved wooden bird to Pip. It's okay. Don't cry. Pip stared up at this strange, pink-skinned creature with wonder instead of fear. You're really a human? Yeah. Are you really a tree? I'm a Molthan, Pip corrected with the serious dignity of the very young. Trees don't talk. Oh, that makes more sense. And just like that, the ice broke. Within an hour, Finn was showing a group of young Quell how humans climbed things, which was apparently a skill their species had never developed, being more inclined toward gliding. Luna had attracted a crowd of Nexari younglings who were fascinated by her ability to solve puzzles that their crystalline minds found impossibly complex. You see patterns differently, observed little Zix, her faceted surface reflecting rainbows as she studied Luna's work. Your processing is chaotic but effective. Chaos is just another kind of order, Luna replied, helping Zix understand a particularly tricky spatial reasoning puzzle. You have to look at it sideways. Meanwhile, Thorn was discovering that his new young assistants had very strong opinions about blacksmithing efficiency. The hammer's too heavy for precision work, Finn observed, watching Thorn shape a piece of decorative metalwork. And you're using too much heat. Waste of fuel. Thorne paused, considering this criticism from someone who barely reached his workbench. You know metalworking? Maintenance protocols? Finn shrugged. Had to repair our ship's systems, learned improvisation techniques. Show me. What followed was a fascinating cultural exchange disguised as a metalworking lesson. Finn's techniques were rougher, more improvised, focused on function over form, but they were also remarkably efficient, born from necessity and limited resources. Interesting approach, Thorne rumbled approvingly. Very practical. Survival makes you practical, Finn said matter-of-factly. Pretty doesn't matter if it doesn't work. True, but... Thorne held up the piece he'd been working on, an intricate flowering vine pattern. Sometimes pretty is the point. Sometimes making something beautiful is how we remember that there's still beauty worth preserving. Finn stared at the delicate metalwork with something approaching wonder. You make things beautiful just because. Just because, Thorne confirmed. Would you like to learn how? That evening, Magistrate Kestrel found himself mediating the most unusual complaint in his administrative career. They've weaponized our children, announced Gorix, still sulking about his destroyed squash patch. My little Bryn came home asking about tactical advantages and defensive positions. She's 6 cycles old. She's also figured out how to protect herself from the thorn-winged birds that keep stealing from your garden, Kestrel pointed out. Finn taught her how to set up harmless deterrents. That's not the point. They're turning our peaceful younglings into beings capable of protecting themselves, Willa suggested mildly. How terrible! You don't understand. Gorix's bark was turning that agitated brown color again. They think differently. They plan for violence. They expect betrayal. They survived something that would have destroyed most of us, Kestrel interrupted firmly. And despite that, they're here, helping our children, learning our crafts, and protecting our gardens from pest birds. What exactly is your complaint? Gorix deflated slightly. It's just unsettling. The way they look at everything like it might be dangerous. Maybe, Willa said gently, because in their experience, everything has been dangerous. Can you imagine what that does to a child? The room fell silent as the adults contemplated this. To grow up expecting betrayal, violence, abandonment. It was almost unthinkable for beings who'd lived their entire lives in peaceful communities. They're getting better, though, Thorne offered quietly. Finn laughed today. Actually laughed when little Pip tried to climb like him and got stuck upside down on a branch. It was nice to hear. Luna smiled when she solved that crystal pattern puzzle, Willa added. A real smile, not the careful expression she uses when she's analyzing threats. And Vale, Kestrel said thoughtfully. Vale fell asleep in the sunshine yesterday while watching the younglings play. No defensive positions, no escape routes planned. Just sleeping like a normal child. They were adapting, slowly but surely. The question was whether Haven's Edge was ready to adapt to them. The answer came sooner than anyone expected, in the form of 3 ships descending from the evening sky with considerably less dramatic flair than escape pods, but infinitely more menace. Pirates didn't usually announce their intentions with warning shots, but these ones seemed to be in a charitable mood. The first blast took out the village's communication array with surgical precision, a clear message that this was now an isolated incident. Well, Kestrel said, watching the ships settle into landing formation around their peaceful village. This is going to be interesting. Interesting was one word for it. Terrifying was another. But as the villagers ran for cover and the adults tried to figure out what to do about armed invaders, 3 small figures were already moving with the fluid precision of beings who'd been expecting this moment all their lives. The human children had come home just in time for war. The pirates of the Crimson Void had raided 43 settlements in the past Galactic Standard month, and they'd developed a rather efficient routine. Land dramatically, fire a few warning shots, watch the locals cower, demand tribute, collect valuables, maybe rough up anyone who looked defiant, then leave with minimal fuss. Simple, profitable, and rarely requiring actual violence. Captain Grimm, whose scarred physique was particularly well-suited to intimidation tactics, stepped off his ship expecting the usual terrified submission. Instead, he found himself facing a village that seemed oddly empty. "Bit quiet, isn't it?" muttered his lieutenant, a nervous Thraxan who went by Scar. "Where is everyone?" "Hiding," Grimm said confidently. "They always hide first. Give them a few minutes to work up the courage for groveling." What they didn't know was that 3 small figures were currently conducting what Luna called reconnaissance assessment from the grain storage building's upper level. The children had moved the moment the ships appeared, not to hide, but to gather intelligence. "Standard raider formation," Finn observed quietly, his voice carrying none of the casual tone he'd developed around the villagers. This was combat mode, and the transformation was startling. 3 ships, probably 30 personnel total. Mixed armament, nothing too sophisticated. "Crimson void markings," Luna added, her eyes tracking movement patterns with mechanical precision. "Known for intimidation tactics over actual violence. Prefer easy targets." Vale, who'd been silent during their tactical assessment, suddenly spoke up with the kind of cold certainty that would have terrified anyone who'd grown used to his childish enthusiasm. They chose wrong. Meanwhile, the villagers were discovering that their peaceful nature had left them remarkably unprepared for hostile visitors. Magistrate Kestrel found himself in the unenviable position of trying to organize a surrender that would minimize casualties, while secretly wondering if his administrative training had covered anything remotely useful for this situation. "Perhaps if we just give them what they want," he began. But Thorn's rumbling voice cut him off. "Those children," the blacksmith said slowly. "Where are the human children?" The question sent a chill through the assembled adults. In their panic, they'd forgotten about their most vulnerable residents. 3 traumatized younglings who'd probably witnessed their parents' deaths and had every reason to expect the worst from armed strangers. "They'll be hiding," Willa said, but her crystalline surface was flickering with uncertainty. "They're clever. They'll stay safe." That's when Finn dropped through the grain chute with the kind of controlled fall that suggested extensive practice, landing silently in the middle of their huddle. The adults jumped collectively, which would have been amusing under different circumstances. "Status report," he said without preamble. "Defensive capabilities, available weapons, evacuation protocols." Kestrel stared at this 12-cycle-old who was apparently treating their crisis like a military briefing. We don't have any weapons. We're a peaceful settlement. We were hoping to negotiate." "Negotiate?" Finn repeated the word like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "With pirates, who've already disabled your communications and surrounded your village." "Well, when you put it like that," Thorn began. "There is no negotiation." Luna's voice came from directly overhead as she rappelled down a support beam with casual expertise that made everyone nervous. "Pirates take everything they want and eliminate witnesses when convenient. Standard operating procedure." "But surely they're reasonable beings," Willa started. Vale answered that by sliding down the wall like he'd been doing it his entire life, which the adults reflected grimly. He probably had been. "Reasonable beings don't disable communications first. That's elimination protocol." The 3 children stood in their unconscious defensive triangle, and suddenly the adults realized they were looking at the only beings in the village who actually understood their situation. "What do we do?" Kestrel asked, and the fact that he was asking children for military advice would have been absurd if it wasn't so desperately necessary. "You hide," Finn said simply. "Get everyone to the root cellars. Stay quiet. Stay hidden." "What about you?" Thorn asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We handle it," Luna said matter-of-factly. "You're children," Willa protested. "You can't possibly—" "We're humans," Vale interrupted, and suddenly his 8-cycle-old voice carried undertones that belonged on a battlefield. "This is what we do." Outside, Captain Grimm was growing impatient. "Enough waiting. Burn something visible. Get their attention." The first building to catch fire was the community center, flames licking hungrily at the wooden structure. The message was clear: cooperate or watch your home burn. That's when the pirates discovered that Haven's Edge had acquired some very unusual new residents. The first indication came when Scar's weapon simply vanished from his hands. One moment he was holding a plasma rifle, the next he was staring at empty air while a small human child disappeared into the smoke with military-grade stealth that shouldn't have been possible for someone barely tall enough to reach an adult's waist. "What the?" Scar began, then stopped talking permanently as a carefully thrown rock struck a pressure point that Luna had identified from her anatomy studies with Willa. "Contact!" Grim barked into his communicator. "We have hostiles." "Hostiles," came the confused response. "Sir, scans show only agricultural equipment and residential structures." "Small hostiles," Grim clarified, watching in disbelief as his advanced team was systematically neutralized by what appeared to be feral children using tactics that belonged in Special Forces training manuals. The siege of Haven's Edge had begun, and the pirates were about to learn why the galaxy told scary stories about humans. Captain Grimm had been in the piracy business for 15 galactic standard cycles, and he'd seen his share of unexpected resistance. Planetary defense forces, automated security systems, even the occasional group of plucky civilians with hunting weapons. But he'd never, in his most fevered nightmares, imagined being outmaneuvered by 3 children who moved like ghosts and struck like lightning. "Status report," he snarled into his communicator, watching his supposedly elite raiding team stumble around the village like confused tourists. "We've lost contact with Squads 2 and 5, came the nervous reply. "Squad 3 reports their equipment is malfunctioning, and Squad 4 says they're being stalked by shadows." "Shadows don't steal plasma rifles," Grim snapped. "Find those human cubs and eliminate them." What Grim didn't realize was that those cubs had spent the last month learning every inch of Haven's Edge. They knew which buildings had connecting tunnels, which rooftops offered the best sight lines, and which of Thorne's gardening tools could be repurposed into remarkably effective weapons. Luna crouched in the blacksmith's workshop, rapidly assembling what she generously called tactical equipment from Thorne's supplies. A length of chain here, some metal stakes there, add a bit of leverage and basic physics, and suddenly you had a very effective area denial system. "Perimeter secured on the east approach," Finn's voice whispered through their improvised communication system. A network of speaking tubes that connected the root cellars, disguised as part of the village's irrigation system. 2 hostiles neutralized, equipment confiscated. "West approach clear," Vale reported with the clinical efficiency of someone who just single-handedly turned 3 armed pirates into very confused, very unconscious pirates. Proceeding to secondary objectives. The villagers, huddled in their root cellars, listened to these reports with a mixture of awe and terror. These were the same children who'd been learning to make decorative metalwork and playing with younglings just hours ago. Now they sounded like seasoned military operatives conducting a textbook defensive operation. "How are they doing this?" whispered Gorix, his earlier complaints about tactical younglings seeming rather petty now. "They're protecting their home," Willa said quietly, and something in her tone made everyone pause. This is their home now, and humans, apparently, take that very seriously. Above ground, Captain Grimm was discovering the limitations of standard pirate tactics when faced with opponents who'd learned warfare from necessity rather than training manuals. His forces were designed to intimidate peaceful civilians, not conduct military operations against adversaries who treated every garden shed like a potential fortress and every farming tool like a weapon. "Sir," came another increasingly frantic report, "the small ones have established overlapping fields of fire using modified agricultural equipment. We can't advance without taking casualties." "They're children!" Grimm roared. "How many children can there be?" "3, sir, but they're everywhere." That's when Grimm made his first tactical error. Frustrated by the unexpected resistance, he decided to force the issue by threatening the civilian population directly. If the humans wanted to play soldier, he'd remind them what happened to villages that harbored insurgents. "Burn it all," he ordered. "Everything. Let them choose between surrender and watching their precious village turn to ash." It was, in retrospect, exactly the wrong threat to make to beings who'd already lost everything once before. The pirates' second wave advanced on the residential district with incendiary weapons, expecting to force a quick surrender through the threat of total destruction. Instead, they found themselves facing something unprecedented: an entire village of civilians who'd been transformed into a coordinated defense force. Because while the human children had been neutralizing the advanced teams, they'd also been teaching quick lessons in concealment, basic ambush tactics, and how to turn peaceful farming equipment into surprisingly effective weapons. The gentle Molthan discovered their natural camouflage abilities were perfect for surprise attacks. The scholarly Quell found their aerial capabilities ideal for reconnaissance and coordination. Even the crystalline Nexari learned to use their light-reflecting properties to create confusion and disorientation among the attackers. "This is impossible," muttered Scar's replacement, watching a group of what should have been helpless civilians execute a pincer movement that would have impressed military academies. "Civilian populations don't organize this quickly." "Civilian populations," Finn's voice came from somewhere uncomfortably close, "don't usually have proper motivation." That's when the pirates discovered that their weapons had been systematically sabotaged, their ship's landing systems disabled, and their communication equipment mysteriously reprogrammed to broadcast embarrassing personal confessions on all frequencies. Captain Grimm found himself cornered in the village square, surrounded by beings he'd intended to terrorize, facing 3 small humans who looked perfectly capable of ending his career permanently. "Surrender terms?" Luna inquired politely, as if discussing market prices rather than military defeat. "Your children," Grimm said weakly. "You can't. This is our home," Vale said simply. "You threatened our family." And suddenly Grimm understood exactly why the galaxy told scary stories about humans. Not because they were monsters, but because when you threatened what they protected, they became something far more dangerous than monsters. They became absolutely, implacably determined. The pirates surrendered. The village celebrated, and 3 human children finally, truly came home.